Hi, folks. This is Roage. I'm here with some friends, and we're going to talk about true court of law and what they are. And we got a whole set of bullet points we're going to go over, and then we're going to have an open discussion about it, so we can figure out how we can, once we get a lawful government, how best to actually handle it. So there are some things that we need to get up to speed on. And I like it as a more open conversation because I think people will ask the right kind of questions, and we'll be able to, answer those to their satisfaction here. I think I'm going to turn this cooler off while I'm doing this. There we go. So it'll be a little bit quieter. Okay, so can you guys hear me out there?
Weird.
Yep.
Okay, looks like we got good sound and it's feeding back through the way it's supposed to. So, excuse me. Sorry, always happens. Okay. So, luckily, Lori provided a list of bullet points that we're going to go over, and Pete was kind of interested in this also. So these are the discussion points, and they're a set of questions and ideas that she wants me to address. And well, let's all address that. Then the first one is why we no longer have true courts of law. Anybody ever have an idea what that is and the reason of why we no longer have true courts of law?
Yes, because they've tricked us into these fictional legal system that we have.
Yeah, that's that. Yep. But how does that happen? How can we end up being tricked? That's the question.
Through our ignorance.
Yeah. All right. So technically, what we've been going through, and we haven't had true courts of law for a long time. Not generally. I mean, there's always a few stewards at the top that knew, the basic principles of law, and they were comporting themselves under that. But most of the rank and file people have really no experience with that at all, because this is kind of the experiment that general consciousness is going through. We don't really appreciate the power of law, while we have it, because we tend to take it for granted. The best way to learn why it's important is to actually have it removed from you and then live life without it. And if you look at all the weird things that are going on around the world and in government and with respect to criminals that are, committing crimes and apparently just walking around and nobody's actually doing anything about it. Well, the reason is because some of these people know the law sufficiently to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't use that court against me. It doesn't have the authority. So until we learn how to recreate these courts, then they're going to do what it is that they're going to do, and it's technically divine right. You can't use fiction against people who have remedied to the law, and that's a basic principle. Now, I'm not going to really go into some of the differences. Well, maybe we will. Well, we'll talk about the differences of between legal and lawful, because our courts are legal systems, and these legal systems are rules that were set up generally by a bunch of people that got together and agreed on them. Unfortunately, those people that agreed on those rules were not us. So they agreed, on certain policies and rules and stuff that they wanted us to be subject to, but they themselves wouldn't subject themselves to it. Our trouble is that we decided that we were going to subject ourselves to it, and there's a lot going on that we don't truly appreciate. So why we don't have courts of law is basically this. People who are ignorant of the law do not enjoy justice. Okay, so we've gone through a long period where most of the people did not have a constructive knowledge of the law. What we were given were technically monopoly box top rules. So the rules to monopoly are written on the top of the box by by the game company, and those rules change anytime they decide that they're going to change. With the law, you don't have that flexibility. Okay, the law is the law. What is right, and what is wrong. And these basic precedents, they have been set, and we did have systems like common law, the common law courts. These basic principles in law were practiced often, and people had to, by trial and error, had to figure out, okay, what are these principles, what are these laws. And so that's where common law actually started evolving and became, had a more clear picture of what was right and what was wrong. However, in the interim, especially around the right after the revolution here in the United States, we stopped operating under a common law court and turned it right on over to what we thought was a lawful government. And that was thoroughly infiltrated very early on, and by the time 1861 came around, it had disappeared. So what was put in its place was a corporate fiction, and technically a corporation. After 1861, the people decided that, hey, the union, the lawful government that we put into place, isn't serving our needs, so they pretty much walked away from it. And that happened on March 27th, 1861. The southern states here in the United States decided, no, that's it. You're not serving our interests, so we're breaking the union. Well, at which point Abraham Lincoln was no longer president and didn't have the authority to do what he did, but he did it anyway, and apparently nobody figured it out. So they had a big war, and it was a civil war, so people were fighting over it. However, they couldn't get the southern state representatives back into Congress to vote on a new session of Congress because the southern states weren't consenting. And if we realize where governments derive their just power, they derive their just power by the consent of the people. Well, the southern people of the southern states were not consenting. So therefore, what we have here is no longer lawful government. So they tried to figure out a solution for a long time to try to see how they could actually, come up with a quote-unquote reconstruction. And there were several theories, but basically what they did was, under the Organic Law Act of 1871, the issue was that the city of Washington, D.C. and Georgetown didn't have a government. So they decided that they were going to create a government for the city of Washington, D.C. and the city of Georgetown next door. Well, they did it as a corporation, and they incorporated it. Now, when Congress, the de facto Congress, because it wasn't a lawful Congress, when they voted on that, they changed one of the words. They changed the word "of" to "for." So instead of it being "of the United States," this city government, of the cities of Washington, D.C., it was changed to "for the United States." So therefore, that government, that city government, that municipal government became the government of the United States. It's a corporation. That hung around until 1913, and then they figured out how to create a lawful government out of Washington, D.C., and so they were off to the races with that. So technically, the United States of America, all capital letters, is really not the States United, okay, under the old republic. So they have their own constitution, and that constitution was adopted on the behalf of the people, not by the people. Why? Because they couldn't adopt it because they'd been all converted into U.S. citizens or residents or some sort of fictional entity, technically, a fictional entity is like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, they don't have their own mind. So they can't accept the Constitution on their own. It has to be accepted on their behalf. So we believe ourselves to be persons when really under the law we don't want to be persons, because a person is a fiction. It's a corporate fiction, and it technically waives that entity. If you call yourself that entity, you technically waive all of your plenary rights, your real rights as a man or a woman. And I'm not going to say constitutional rights, because there's no such thing as constitutional rights. There are rights protected under a constitution, or constitutionally protected rights, but there are no such thing as constitutional rights. Why? Because rights come from you directly from the guy who runs the place. Okay? Is the phonetic I use. The eternal supreme authority is the one that gives you rights. And so if you have a persistent connection to this being, then you can exercise a right. If you do not have a connection, then you're going to exercise what's called a wrong. One leads to joy, the other one leads to suffering. But that suffering's great, because it really teaches you a lesson, and that's what this is all about. So, the reason we don't have true courts of law is because we've rendered ourselves ignorant of the law, and that was by our own choice. And unless we actually remedy that ignorance of the law, then we are not going to enjoy true courts of law. And not only that, but lawful government is for lawful people. And if we're not a lawful people, then we're not going to enjoy lawful government, and we're not going to enjoy justice under the law. So the responsibility for doing this is up to each one of us. Each of us individually has to actually go through the process of educating themselves to the law and do this. Now, some of the things that make that a little bit problematic is because for the longest time we've been listening to people teach us how to be slaves, but they really haven't taught us to be sovereign. So we've got sort of a learning curve, and I on some of the material that I provide, I try to give people a help in that. I'm not the only one by any means. There are other people that understand these same principles too. But the help is there for anybody who is willing to actually to do that. When they are ready, then they will find the information that they need to go through this transition. So if any of you out there actually think you're here by accident, I'll let you in on a little secret. You are not here by accident. You're here on purpose. So the next bullet point was, what are true courts of law and how do they work? Okay, well, a true court of law is a place where you settle conflict. Okay, and what you want to do is, some sort of event occurred and you have two parties that are on opposite sides. The reason that there are courts of law is because simply fighting it out on a battlefield is a problem. So the court of law is a place where you can utilize trial by combat without anybody truly getting hurt. It is, and the whole idea is, under trial by combat, the knight who is true will always prevail over the knight that is false. Okay, meaning that the truth will always prevail. Okay, so we don't have much experience with truth because we've disconnected from truth. Okay, truth is that supreme authority. When we disconnect from that authority, then we're confused, and then we experience a continual weakness because we do not understand any kind of principles in law. Why? Because that's where the law is. So when you engage in actions that are in accordance with the truth and in accordance with that source of law, then you will be exercising a right. If you're engaging in actions that are not in accord with that truth and law, then you'll be exercising a wrong. Well, sometimes it's a little difficult to know whether or not what you're doing is right or wrong. some things are a bit complicated. So you apply a true court of law to see if you could discern from the all supreme being what he thinks with respect to what's right and wrong. So the courts basically go through and they try to interpret the will of the supreme authority through the application of precedent, through things that were done in the past. It's not based on consensus, folks. It's not because a majority of people decide that that's the way it's going to be. It is absolute. It's not relative. All right, and this is something that a lot of folks in our modern, in the modern world, are going to have a little trouble getting to, because there's no gray areas on these things. Okay, this is not subject to your interpretation. It just is. Okay, and whether you know it and whether you don't know it, that's truly the only real issue. So a court of law is the means by which 12 people on a jury and one independent arbiter, and then two parties that argue a position. That's how they determine what is right and what is wrong with that respect, in that respect. Now, does it always work that way? Well, that depends on the quality of the jurors. Okay? If there are jurors, if all 12 jurors are sufficiently educated to the law, are connected to the supreme authority such that they know how to communicate with that supreme authority, then the verdicts that you're going to render, that court is going to render, are going to be very close to gauging the mind of the supreme authority. If they are confused, meaning that they are not atoned, right? They're not at one mind with the truth or this supreme authority, then the verdicts that they're going to render are not going to be, let's say, always 100% in accord with the law. All right. So if you want courts that can arrive at truth, then it is incumbent on the population to produce jurors that have that capacity. Okay, so this is part of what I teach in the cheat sheet Mark 5, is the capacity for people to actually reestablish that atonement. And what is atonement? Well, it's at, mente means mind, right? At one mind. And you're at one mind with the supreme authority. Therefore, if you are at one mind with the supreme authority and the 11 other people on the jury with you are at one mind on the jury, then you are all atoned. Therefore, you can, in very short order, you can discern which party that's bringing the complaint before the court is right and which one is wrong. Okay, so that's how these courts actually work, and that's what they do. Now, if you've been watching TV, or watching procedural and administrative courts as they're defined under the U.S. Code, then you're not going to see a real true court of law. A true court of law has the power to actually decide life or death. If there's a criminal brought before the court, those 12 people can decide whether or not that guy is guilty, and whether or not he deserves to be punished, or if he is not guilty. They can make that decision, and they can render an appropriate punishment. Now, one of the nice things about a true court of law, and the nice things about lawful jurors, is they have the capacity to exercise mercy and compassion, and they have the capacity to interpret the law based on specific extenuating circumstances. So in our procedural and administrative courts right now, they have sentencing guidelines, and they have all of these different procedural rules, all of which only they understand. And of course, you have to put your trust, right, which is a bad thing. You have to rely on some guy that's going to interpret all that procedure for you. And generally, he's going to interpret that procedure to to his advantage and not your advantage. So if you were charged with a crime and brought before an administrative court, you're technically at the mercy of people that are really not interested in helping you out. They're acting in their own interest. This is a big problem here in the United States because we got a huge flaw in our system, and I'm pretty sure that it is true for nearly every other corporate government on this planet, in that they have these things called grand juries, right? A federal grand jury. Okay, what do? Well, these are private citizens that meet in secret. They hear evidence, and they determine whether or not somebody should be charged, okay, or if or an action should be done. But technically, they will hand down what's called an indictment. Okay, now here, where the flaw is 12 people may have sufficient evidence to say, okay, we are going to indict you, meaning that we recommend that you are that you are to be prosecuted, right? So what happens with a grand jury generally is they'll hand it to the Department of Justice or an attorney general of the several states. They'll hand that indictment over to the attorney general, or they'll hand it over to the Department of Justice, at which point they get to decide whether or not they're going to go ahead and prosecute. Now, one of the things that we've noticed here is a considerable amount of paralysis here in the United States with respect to, and just look at the case of Judicial Watch and Tom Fitton. Okay, this man is amassing clear-cut violations of code, principles, and law, and say, hey, here's all the evidence. And not only that, but there have been some grand juries that have been impaneled, and there have been indictments handed down, and those indictments haven't been acted upon. And this is all done in secret. That's a broken system, folks. Now, a court of law isn't saddled with that. A court of law has supreme power. In fact, a jury of lawful citizens have the power over the government. They are themselves individually sovereign. And when 12 people decide that, hey, wait a minute, this law that the legislators came up with, yeah, this guy is guilty of it, but we 12 people don't feel that we want to have to obey this law either, because we think that the legislature and the president signed something into law that we don't like. So therefore, they can nullify that law instantly. It's like the law never existed, and the guy walks free. Yeah, he's guilty of breaking the law, but those 12 people have the power to actually say, nope, we're not doing that. Now, I don't care how many of the TV court shows you've seen, how many movies you've seen that had courtrooms in it. One thing that you haven't seen is on TV is something called jury nullification, where the jury goes through, evaluates the rightness of the law, and determines whether or not that's a law that they want to actually have. Now, if you're wondering why we have a legislature that can write laws that take 700 lifetimes to read, literally more than 700 lifetimes to read, that's because the safety mechanism hasn't been used for so long. It hasn't been that these guys just write laws that right now they don't even read. And yet we're expected to be subject to all of this, but we don't know what our rights are and our power is as a juror, that we have the power to actually nullify anything that's in the state, county, or federal government that we don't, that 12 people decide that, hey, we're not going to do this. Right? That's why statute and regulation have exploded in this country, is because the mechanism by which stupid law goes away is not where leaving it to Congress to vote on it, or waiting for the courts to judge to throw it out. That wasn't the mechanism by which our laws were supposed to, or bad law was supposed to be thrown out. The mechanism was supposed to reside with the jury. And the jury decides not only whether or not the guy actually did what it was that he said that he did, but whether or not the law is just, and the law is something that 12 reasonable people actually want. So if you don't have that mechanism in place, there is nothing restraining the government. That's where the true consent is, folks. Right? If governments derive their power by the just consent of the people, okay, how do the people demonstrate that consent? Well, they do it on a jury. Now, we don't even do any of this anymore. If you want more information on that, I mean, contact me. I can put those lightning bolts in your fists if you want. We can definitely show a lot of people that are there right now. They understand these principles because they've gone through enough of the videos that I've put out there to and know why it's important to educate themselves. So, do you guys have a pretty good understanding about how a court of law works and what it is?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Was I fairly complete in explaining it? I mean,
I think so.
yeah, it's like two knights in a court, right? So the king is sitting there, and you have two knights battling over some sort of controversy. Okay, and the knight who wins, he that's the verdict that's rendered. Okay, so a courtroom is set up similar to that. Okay, now there's a movie out there called Kingdom of Heaven. And that principle is actually talked about in that movie. Okay, now it's something that we don't realize that we have access to. It's because we've become confused. We've become demoralized, meaning that we don't have that moral connection anymore. I mean, it's fairly easy to reestablish once but you're going to have to rethink a lot of what you think is reality and what you think is truth, because most of the time what they've done is they've told us a lie, said it was the truth, and we accepted it. So therefore we chose in our ignorance to disconnect ourselves from the real power in this universe. I mean, it is real power. So okay, so I'm going to take a break for a second. Lori, could you fill the space? I got to take a quick little break for a second, and then I'll come back. Okay. So fill the space up, talk about that, and see if you can develop some questions before I get back.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I'm interested to know when did the original three branches of government, was that in the original Constitution, and was this court of law system ever, even for a short period of time, was that used in the beginning of the real United States?
That's a question for. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do believe it was. That's how the courts were set up originally.
Right, and I realized we very quickly lost all of that.
So yeah, I know I've talked to a few of you, and there's a lot of folks out there that have a lot of pieces, but there's a necessity for unifying these principles in law, and it's an exploration of not necessarily what's out there, but what's in us. And once we get to that point where we can know ourselves better, then we can actually start reestablishing our own personal authority. And it's through that own personal authority, it's through that personal responsibility that we start gaining, our true power back. And this is not about hanging criminals or punishing criminals. This has more to do with us making a mistake and allowing the things that are happening in our society right now to happen. One, because we don't realize that we have the power to actually change that. That itself is starting to change. So this is just part of that process. All right, so I'm guessing you guys didn't develop any questions from that. So does that mean that I was pretty pretty useful with respect so far to the issues at hand?
Yeah, I did have one question. So the original Constitution, the real one, did set up the three branches of government right off the bat, and those courts of law, the real courts of law, were used for a short period of time.
Yeah, but there was always an issue.
Not really.
Yeah, there was always an issue with certain parties writing themselves out of that authority. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Right, because and then that maintains it. Like for instance, the bankers, they with respect to our courts, they enjoy sovereign immunity. The courts can't touch them. And that's a big problem.
There was funding for the Revolutionary War from different places, and those people needed to have their representatives.
Oh yeah. I posted a video up on the sharing text about and whether or not you see Q as an authoritative source or not. It actually talks about the original 13th Amendment and with the use of Esquire and those keys.
I saw the serial brain video. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. So, we've been livestock for a long time, and we really need to fix that. And it's up to us to actually fix that. And this is not something where, we're going to fix it by, it's time for us to pick up guns and we have to go and set things right. That's not what needs to happen here. I mean, we have reasonable recourse, and it's just that we don't even know that recourse exists, and that's not their problem. I would suggest that if people think that the solution is to take their AR-15 and go to their local county government and somehow start pointing guns at people, that those officers in that position have every right to shoot you where you stand, because you're not utilizing peaceful recourse because it's unknown to you. So they have a right to defend themselves. I would suggest that you just put the guns away because you really don't need it. And the odd thing is when you begin comporting yourself in a responsible way, you're going to notice something, that you can start counting on them to actually be the most helpful aspect. They're not your enemy. They're not authoritative. They're looking for you to be responsible, and if you can demonstrate that responsibility, and you can comport yourself in a matter that's responsible, you'll find that they're your best allies. And if they're not, then they won't be around long. They'll end themselves. You don't have to do it.
Right. The goal is educating other people and becoming unconfused and becoming fused and helping other people.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the stuff that's going on in national events, I mean, it is primarily a parade of just absurdity, absolute absurdity.
Even arresting and prosecuting all those people wouldn't bring about the real change.
Well, I mean, when you get to a certain point, you think, well, hey, I can't in good conscience use a procedural or administrative court to punish a criminal, because I know that at its heart, it itself is a criminal act. And for me to condone that would be me conspiring to maintain that confusion. And I just can't do that. That's just not me. So there has to be a change. And then there are people that and just me for one. I started reading some of the executive orders that are coming out of the Trump administration with the respect of changing court martial to be capable of going after private citizens. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so you're creating a lawful court. That's great. But that's not our system. How do we take what's going on in Guantanamo and reincorporate it back into our court system? Well, that's a problem. Well, because that whole court system itself it has been changed, created, and molded around, statutes, fictions of law, since 1861. How do we make something real out of something that's fiction? It's a daunting task. Maybe Guantanamo makes sense for an interim step, but quite frankly, I don't think that making that supreme over the Supreme Court with respect to criminality is something I want. I mean, that's a military court. That's not a civil court.
And many more people need to remedy the confusion, as you would say, before a lawful court would even work nationwide.
Yeah. Now a lawful court itself can work if you could find 12 people that know the law. Yeah, you can comport. But what do you do? Right, which brings us, how and where to convene it. Well, anytime you have 12 people that know the law, right, and you have an independent arbitrator, and then you have some sort of conflict that needs to be resolved, then you can convene that court immediately. And in fact, the punishment could be meted out immediately. Okay, now that happened out west. There was a whole idea of they caught you red-handed. Well, we had 2 witnesses that saw you do it. Boom, you're on a rope. Just like that. If there are 12 cowboys sitting around there saying, well, we did see him do it. Yeah, he stole the horse. And stealing a horse, at that time, they wanted it stopped, so it was a hanging offense, and they would do that. Highway robbery, well, you can get shot where you stood. So it is, let's say, abrupt. It's final. And it doesn't lend itself very well to feeling and intention. Okay, I mean, you apply the law. Well, you did this. Well, one of the biggest problems is before you can really start applying that law on people, the people have to first know what law is going to be applied. And people like boundaries. People like rules. They want to know what it is that they're doing is right. Right? So one of the things that we really need to do is this is the education process where we say, hey, we're going to move to a lawful court, and these are the principles that are going to apply in that court. So it's incumbent on you to actually learn what those principles are. But you could have one of the people that do know what a court is and how it works, especially a lawful court, are judges. Judges know this stuff. They don't ever use it, but they know it. So if you wanted to effect a change to move our country quickly to a lawful government, and that includes coming up with an organized system where we actually educate the population to the law, like, why isn't this stuff being taught in school? Well, there's a good reason. I mean, we have a whole population that has never been exposed to these kinds of principles, and those people need to be educated. Now, some people are going to resist. Okay, that's fine. They have to be protected. They may have to be, removed from the general society for a while until they can be properly educated, and there has to be a significant resolve by the population to move in that direction. Otherwise, it just fails. So the whole idea of going through and creating, moving towards a lawful court, you can convene a court anywhere. However, what is it that you would do? What I would do is first, if I had 12 people that convened a lawful court, I would first want to inform the sheriff that there is a new authority in his environment and that he could be deputized under that authority. Now, as I understand it, there's quite a few sheriffs across the United States, and probably in Canada also, that want lawful authority, But since there isn't any lawful authority, they take what they can get. And right now it's only legal authority, and that's what it is. But if they had the option of being deputized... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, you see them popping up every once in a while and in the news saying things like, we're not going to enforce this gun law or what have you.
Yeah. I mean, and I know here in Texas, there's quite a few of them that would love to actually act on the authority of a true court of law. That's where real power is. Are you kidding? I mean, legal procedure, I mean, shoot, they only do it because they have to. This, they would want to. Why? Because this stuff really works. I mean, you got a speedy trial, you got 12 people, they get together, it's, did you do it? Yep, here's the evidence, got witnesses, those witnesses are compelled, the sheriff goes and collects the witnesses, all of that stuff happens just right quick. You get to a sentence, and then, so, hey, the guy's either innocent and he walks, and it's not waiting 2 or 3 years for some sort of decision. That's not a speedy trial. That should be evidence enough that the system as it exists right now is completely broken. All right. So, any other comments? Any questions at this point?
Pete had asked, what do we do in court with the ignorant and insane?
Well, look, whenever you have an issue, and this is part of the transition, and I think the first before we could truly before the a true court of law could actually be effective without actually creating an outrage, is there has to be an organized education process as to what it is, why it needs to happen, and why it works. Because if that court is acting on a general population, then people aren't going to understand that. I mean, it's not like all of a sudden you got 12 people that you go around nabbing all the bad guys in the neighborhood. No. I think officials are easy targets, and most of the time, all the official needs to be done is brought before the court, at which point you can say, hey, we as a jury are going to decide to forego the punishment, provided you, from this point forward, change your ways and you do this. And if you come before this court again, we're going to put you on a rope. And that's all that's going to be needed. Now, with respect to the confused, they need to be taken care of. Okay? They need to be taken care of. Because if they're confused and they're insane, then sane people, meaning that the jury, has a responsibility to exercise care, proper care of those people that are confused, insane, and incompetent and irresponsible. Okay? That doesn't mean you just, punish them. Now, we've had people in this country that have been executed because of statutes, fictions of law, okay, where there were no direct victims. Okay, that's a no-no. Okay, now in a true court of law, if the defendant isn't competent to understand the difference between right and wrong, then he's insane. He's criminally insane. Doesn't mean you execute the guy. It doesn't mean you punish the guy. You certainly don't want him walking around in society. Okay? What you do is you put him in some place where you can remedy his confusion. And I would say, hey, if you need large areas of doing that, I mean, the FEMA camps would be a great place for that. But what would they be re-educating people with? They'd be educating them to the law. And why would that be a good thing? Well, because there's a great benefit. Why? Because you're going to have rights. Those rights are going to be protected, and you're going to have power. Right now, most people feel themselves powerless, disenfranchised. They don't even want to be part of the system. All they do, they allow you to vote, but really, I mean, how do we know? It's all secret balloting. We have no way of actually telling that we have any right or power of self-determination. What this will do is it'll give people the opportunity to actually restore their power, restore their rights. And one of the things that happen to people is they become worthy of that. And if they're not, then hey, look, they have to be kept away from society. That doesn't mean they have to be punished, but you don't get to walk around free. You're taken care of. You're cared for. Okay, and if you're not responsible, then somebody else is responsible for you. Okay, and they can do things even against your will. Why? Because you're not responsible for yourself. Now, if somebody who is rendered confused by the jury or the court is insane, and they can demonstrate that, hey, wait a minute, now I've learned the law, I'm comporting myself, and I'm ready to rejoin society as a whole. Then at which point they can say, oh, okay, yeah, you've been released from the facility, and you can go about your business and pursue happiness to your heart's content. But you don't just go around hanging people. There are a lot of people now that don't understand the difference between legal and lawful, and that's the the next bullet point in the talk. What's the difference between legal and lawful? Well, lawful is all of the rules, principles, laws that govern the physics, and it's physics and the universe. It's what is. Okay, and legal is what man agrees to, and what man interprets as the laws that are out there. So one is technically, I'm going to use the G word, technically God's law, and the other one's man's law. All right, man's law could be anything. Right? If you wanted to play the floor is lava game with consenting adults, you could say, hey, the floor is lava, and then everybody's on the furniture. They don't want to put their foot on the floor because the floor is lava, and that game says, hey, if you put your foot on the lava, then I don't know, then you're it or whatever. All right, there's some sort of competitive advantage and or punishment or whatever sanction. But legal deals with, oh, okay, these are rules that men want to call law. Okay, one's absolute, one's relative, and subject to consent. Right. So all legal systems of law, right, or all lawful systems, all civilized systems of law must provide remedy and recourse. Why? Because it's a function of an agreement, meaning a contract. Right? So if two people want to say, hey, the floor is lava, and one guy says, well, you know what, I don't play this game anymore. The other guy can't say, no, you can't leave the game. Can't say that. Why? Because he has remedy to the law. Where it's real, the floor is not lava, and you can walk on it. Okay? That's why, because civilized systems of law are based on mutual agreement. That's why you can say, no, I'll be judged, or my actions will be determined in a true court of law, and the fact that I'm walking on the floor is no foul. Okay? So what we've taken these rules that are made up, and they're certainly made up, and in fact the legislators in Washington don't even read this stuff anymore. So we're sitting here trying to hop around on one foot, doing all of these things that we're supposed to be doing because hey, it's federal law, but really they don't even read it. It's not even valid, and quite it has no. We don't have the mechanism by which we can actually get rid of it without the consent of the legislators who drafted it in the first place. Quite frankly, if they draft a bill giving them a pay raise, a court of law jury could go through and say, nope, sorry, back to the drawing board. So what this is the people determining what it is, how it is they're going to be governed, and what rules they agree to. Okay? So that's consent. That's a totally different thing from what we have now, where Congress can write any law, and because you call yourself a U.S. citizen, then you're subject to whatever law that is. Now, that's not, it's technically statute. It's statute, code, regulation. They might call it law, but it's technically a fiction of law. And if you want to know what I'm talking about with respect to legal, if you go to Cornell Law, or if you go to Wikipedia and you look up the theory of legal positivism, it'll show you right there what it is. It is the theory that man commands the law. Okay? And if that were true, then we could all hold hands around the world, and we could all decide that gravity is going to be half as strong as it is, because gravity is kind of a pain. It hurts us. So if we all get together and hold hands, and we decide that we want gravity to be half as strong as it is now, does anybody out there think that we'll be able to reduce gravity by doing that?
No.
Okay. Well, why? Because it's the law, right? Right. So we might all get together and write, draft a bill that basically says gravity has to be half as strong, but really you don't have any means of enforcing that. Which brings up another topic, and that is the use of force. Where does the use of force come from? Well, technically, the law doesn't compel performance. And what does that mean? That means there may be a law that says, you're not to murder. Okay? Why? Well, because golden rule. You don't murder because nobody wants to be murdered. That's a general idea. That's where it comes from. Okay? So there's a law that says you're not to murder. Okay? So the law doesn't compel performance.
One of the 10 Commandments.
Well, yeah, of course. That's a codification. That is a precedent. Then people decided, well, you know what? Murdering only causes more murder, so that's probably not something we should be doing. It's sort of like beating your face with a hammer. Okay, most people could probably agree that beating your own face with a hammer is not something that we would consider right. Okay, I'm sure there's a few people out there that think it's right, and they can beat themselves with a hammer all they want. But there's nothing stopping you from beating your own face with a hammer, and there's nothing stopping you from murdering somebody else, because the law doesn't compel performance. But what happens with the law is, when you engage in a particular act, right, that has precedent in the law, and you violate that basic principle, then you're going to be subject to consequences, right? One, if you're beating yourself in the face with a hammer, it's going to hurt. Now, you can't mitigate those consequences. Now, there's nothing stopping you from doing it, but you can't mitigate the fact that, wow, now your nose is flattened against your face and it hurts. Or, wow, you killed somebody and then their family got mad and killed you, right? I mean, if you didn't have a court or anything like that. So this whole idea that of force, where does that come from? Well, force comes as a function of contract. Okay? That's where a contract can force performance. Right? So in our legal system, whenever you see law enforcement officers, what are they enforcing? They're enforcing the terms of a contract. What contract? Right? Well, if you're going to call yourself a U.S. citizen, you've entered into a contract. And they can force you to the terms of that contract even against your will. Why? Because you entered that contract willingly. Now, if a U.S. citizen was a real contract, then they would truly be in the right. The problem is it's a colorable contract. Why? Because the other party is a colorable entity. How do I know this? Well, because I can't shake the hands of Mr. or Mrs. Texas, and I can't shake the hands of Mr. or Mrs. Federal Government of the United States. And since they can't prove lawful continuity past 1861, they don't have the lawful authority, so therefore their contracts are all colorable. And since the money that we use is colorable also, it's legal tender, it's not lawful money. And if any part of a contract is colorable, then the entire contract is colorable. Then we're dealing with colorable contracts, at which point everyone here has the power to remedy to the law, and those colorable contracts lose all force. Now, this is something they don't want you guys to know. Right? Everything is a self-imposed obligation. Why? Because nothing forces you to do anything. Now, if you're ignorant, you might agree to something. You might accept something. But if you're not ignorant, hey, look, this universe doesn't force anything against your will. You might think that, but you agreed to it. Somewhere there's a contract. And if you can figure out when you agreed, and a lot of us agreed to things when we learned how to speak. It goes back that far, right? When we wanted to be an adult, even though all the adults were out of their mind. But we wanted to be an adult just like them, meaning that, hey, we want to be out of our minds just like them, and we did that. You know, now we spend the rest of our lives trying to get back to that pristine state when we were a child, where we actually still had power.
But it looked like so much fun back then.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It always looks fun. You know, oh, well, you know, it's the enticement. You know, that's the temptation. You know, it looks fun. And it's an appearance.
Right.
You know, it's an appearance. You know, so those are just certain things. Now, let's get back to the bullet points. Next bullet point was who would qualify as judges, jurors, and bailiffs. Okay, so I pretty much answered that question. Anybody want to go at it? So who would qualify as judges, jurors, and bailiffs?
People that know true law.
Yep. Those people that know true law can exercise rights, know their rights, and comport themselves responsibly. Right? Because here's the thing. With rights come responsibilities. They tell you that. Right? Everybody's heard that out there, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. But what they don't tell you is if you're not responsible, you can't exercise a right. Why? Because rights require responsibility. If you are not responsible in a lawful sense, you cannot exercise a right. Now, they don't want to tell you that because they've been teaching us how to be irresponsible. Why? Because they don't teach us the law. If you don't know the law, you can't be responsible. Why? Because you're not going to respond correctly to your environment. You're going to be playing the Flora's lava game when really there's a rock flying for your head and you don't get out of the way because you're too busy, playing the legal Flora's lava game. Well, that's not reacting correctly to your environment. If you're doing things that are based in fiction and that overrides a proper response to stimulus in your environment, then you're not sane and competent and you're not acting responsibly. If you're acting to meet some sort of future obligation, then you may be doing something wrong right now with hopes that something else is going to manifest in the future, right? So what do? Well, we hope for the better, and we do things based on what might happen, and then when the future rolls around, we find out, well, everything that we've done was inappropriate for what's happening right now. So that's not acting responsibly. Acting responsibly is making decisions and committing acts in the present moment. That's the only place you can do that is in the present moment. So if you're responding correctly to things in the present moment, that's where truth lives, okay, in the present moment. If you're constantly thinking about the past, and your behavior is based on things that happened in the past because you can't get past something, then you're not acting responsibly. Why? Because you're not making decisions based on what's going on right in front of your face right now.
And you want to be making those decisions based on the golden rule? Is that for someone who's trying to go through the process?
That's, well, there you go. Well, and there's the other thing. Let your conscience be your guide. Right? I mean, I mean, comporting yourself in a lawful way is pretty easy. You know, you say, okay, well, would 12 reasonable people believe that what I just did, would they agree with me? Okay. Right. That's pretty easy. And you don't have to have a whole warehouse full of words on paper to decide what it is that you should or shouldn't do. Right? You just say, would 12 people believe that what I'm doing is right? Would they agree with me? Because ultimately that's what it would be, right? But you got to have those 12 reasonable people, and that's
12 Roger fools.
Well, you know, I don't know whether or not I'm reasonable. One could argue that, you know, I'm rather, well, if you talk to my wife. she has a whole different idea there. But you know, hey, you know, look, we're human beings. We take limitations here, and this is why great care has to be taken by anybody on a jury. Okay, and that's why there are 12 of them, because having 12 on there can root out certain problems. Because even 12 people who are atoned may have a different, may not know. It may be a completely new question, at which point they may decide a particular thing, at which point then it creates a massive outrage. And you know that a jury has created the wrong decision because it creates an automatic outrage, and there's an immediate feedback. So you can say, oh, okay, and at which point then somebody has to go through and overturn or overturn that decision. Okay, so I can cite, for example, what happened to habitual criminal offender Rodney King. Notice that I didn't say motorist. Rodney King, by his own admission, was a habitual criminal. And however, that didn't give the police officers permission to completely deprive him of his basic rights and beat him mercilessly at the side of the road. So now you had police officers that have overstepped their authority by violating his rights. And how is exercise, let's say Rodney King was, let's say, not right in his head. Okay, one could argue that he wasn't right in his head. Beating him for that mercilessly isn't exercising proper care with respect to the confused. Right? So here you had the jurors, after watching the video and seeing what was going on, ended up letting all of the police officers that were involved in that to walk away. And then what happened with that? Well, the folks ended up tearing the city apart. Well, that is that outrage, right? That happened. They were outraged. And it was beyond the fact, this was not a racial problem. What made people mad was this was fairly clear, right? There was an overstepping of authority, and yet the people who had the responsibility to do something about it failed them miserably. So, of course, there was an episode of outrage. But honestly, I don't think I would be comfortable at all with a lot of these folks sitting on a jury. I don't think they're reasonable. I don't think they're competent, and they're certainly not my peer. So I'm not going to consult people who are insane on whether or not what I do is sane or insane. That's crazy. So before we can actually put courts that are going to be fair and courts that can actually meet justice, we have to change. I don't think we're at a level right now. I mean, I see the stuff that's posted on Twitter, and I see, events happening on the street. I mean, there may be a few of us that actually have, some fairly good sense. But I mean, in large part, what do you guys think? You think this population is ready for something like this?
No.
No.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I think kind of, if I might interject,
Sure.
kind of get back to the basics, right? I think people like Andrew speaking about going through the process, actually trying to understand the true nature of our being is the challenge. And is it possible that everybody on the planet's going to go through this process? Probably not. But I will say this. Our goal should be that our institutions, which we seem to need to kind of survive and stop the insane from going roughshod and destroying them, we have to ensure that those institutions are of the highest caliber.
Yeah.
And that would be the most we could hope for, is that we realize that we have to have governance because of the human condition, or our separation from reality, let's say. Like everything in our society is based on fiction. Corporations, for instance, how do you bring justice to a fictional entity that makes a poison that kills thousands of people with cancer or whatever? But anyway, I guess all we could hope for is that we create institutions or reform institutions to be the highest integrity and follow the law.
Yeah. Well, you bring up an interesting point, and it's something that I've talked about. Corporations are quote unquote persons. Right? And however, a corporation itself doesn't have a will, okay? And the officers of the corporation are specifically, because of the nature of the corporation itself, immune from personal liability. So there is no accountability. Right? So by their design, there is no accountability. Now, that's dangerous with respect to having companies running around doing anything they want and nobody actually held to account. That's dangerous, but it's not near as dangerous as having your government being a corporation. And that's what we have today. So here we are, a people who have a corporate government, and somehow we're puzzled as to why there is no accountability. Well, it's a corporation. By its design, there is no accountability. Now, how do we fix that? Well, it's real easy. I'd go, were I the governor of Texas, if I were Greg Abbott, I'd very easily just come out there and say, well, in 5 years, every corporation operating here in Texas has to have one true guy who the people of Texas can hold directly responsible for any criminal activity committed by that corporation. At which point, if the corporations do not have that kind of fiduciary, then they do not operate here in Texas. Now, what's going to happen? If the corporation doesn't choose anybody, they don't operate here in Texas. Okay? However, who would want to be responsible for the conduct of the entire corporation without having the authority over the corporation? At which point, these fiduciaries would have ultimate responsibility, because they know that if there's anybody within that entire corporation that ends up doing something that injures people out on the outside of the corporation, that they are the ones that are going to be held responsible. So nobody in their right mind would accept responsibility over that corporation without having the specific authority to actually deal with everybody in that corporation with respect to how that corporation comports itself. So very easily we can adapt a court of law system to a corporation quite easily by saying, hey, you give us a fiduciary, and we will put him. It says we will put him in jail, or we will or we'll punish him in more extreme means, if necessary. At which point the corporations would now be under exclusive, potent power of at least somebody who can be held to account and has an interest in the conduct of the corporation being conscientious with respect to the others in the community. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It sounds like a very good plan. Now we could apply something similar to departments, government, bureaucracies.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, some of us here have experienced the wrath of the IRS or other department bureaucracies where there is really no redress or recourse.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Well, under something that was kind of interesting that happened, William Barr actually wrote a letter to Congress with respect to some of the things that he's looking at. And here in the United States, we have titles in federal code. And he was going to review the conduct of government officials against Title 18-242, which says no officer can use color of law to deprive any citizen of a right. That's pretty important. And this is exactly what they're doing. They're using these federal codes to violate people's basic plenary rights. Now, notice I didn't say constitutional rights. I said plenary right. And plenary right is indisputable. Indisputable, coming from the supreme authority. That's it. It doesn't come from a piece of paper. It doesn't come from a function of a trust or an agreement. It's plenary. It is absolute. So he's evaluating the conduct of federal government employees based on that criteria, whether or not they used statute to violate people's true rights. They did that in my case on April 19th, 2012. They used statute to violate my plenary right. And they were wondering why everything went downhill from there. I mean, they still had Obama. They were going like gangbusters. And suddenly they hit a road bump. They hit a bump in the road. And I'm fairly intimate with that bump because I believe I was part of that. Some of the stuff that you're seeing happening right now was a problem that they created. Why? Because all civilized systems of law must provide remedy and recourse to the law, and that was the right they violated. They did not provide me recourse to the law, so therefore they're no longer a civilized system. They are a criminal system. And in the universe, a criminal system, when you have a real witness that knows the law and you're proximate to a violation of such a right, justice kicks in and you go away. What we're seeing is that going away part. Now, these things are changing. Now, if we're moving to lawful government, I say so be it. But right now, the system as it exists cannot accommodate me, and I'm not changing. I decided I was going to be American, and I'll be American. Whether the system can accommodate me or not. If they want to hang around, they can accommodate me. If they do not or cannot or don't want to move in that direction, then they're not going to be around. At least there's some people at the top that realize that. And I think that is what is making manifest some of the things that are going on, especially here in the United States. So, all right.
You had said something about putting people at the top who are held accountable. of corporations, even in higher government positions of agencies. And it may have been a throwaway line, but you'd said that you wouldn't be in your right mind if you were to accept that position. So wouldn't we, if we were to try to get towards that, be putting people who are not in their right mind?
Well,
and
no,
we'd be
yeah.
ruled over by the insane?
No, what I said was nobody in their right mind would accept responsibility for a corporation without having the authority over that corporation, right? So what would it do? It would put a fiduciary in a position that would have ultimate responsibility and ultimate authority over the conduct of the corporation. So no sane man would accept the responsibility without the authority. Okay, without the required authority. Right, so I didn't mean to say that, hey, no sane man would ever accept that. I mean, yeah, if I had the authority over, let's say, Google, and I could ensure that Google wasn't out there overstepping people's rights, so the entire corporation would have to be structured in a different place. They would learn ethics overnight. And if you notice when I said, hey, I wasn't implementing it overnight, I said in 5 years. Why? Because I know full well that changing the structure of a corporation with respect to the command it takes a little bit. And to expect that to happen overnight is unreasonable.
A lot of what we've seen with Donald Trump has been one of the analogies is turning the ship around. This major battleship that we've been, steering down the wrong road for a long time. And there was a point where we were going full steam ahead, and then Trump took over, and he sort of started to slow that. And at one point, maybe the last 6 months or so, he started to turn it around. Right. So. Are you thinking that by the end of 8 years that he may have actually started to turn the ship around and actually head full steam the other direction?
It began in 2012. Okay, it began in 2012. The odd thing is, Pete, is the amount of people that had who had eyes on my specific situation. It wasn't a few people. There were a lot of people. And there were a lot of people at very high levels. Why? Because early on, when you used Google Analytics and the YouTube Analytics, you could actually see where people were coming in from. And every time I'd post a video, I'd watch the same bounces happen over and over and over again. Like they were waiting for me to, and especially in and around 2012 and then 2013, every video I would post would have the same bounces. Right, it would hit here, it would hit in Round Rock, then it would hit Austin, then it would hit either New Haven, Connecticut, DC, then it would hit City of London, then it would hit the Vatican, then it would hit to some place called Not Set. And every time I put a video out, it was always the same guys. So they were watching.
From the planet of nowhere.
Yeah. So, here I am. I mean, crawling around on this rock thinking that nothing's happening. Yet, when I can trace a lot of the stuff back, like, I finally said, hey, look, this is it. If you don't act now, that's it. Your New World Order goes away. When I issued that notice, it was a week later where Hillary Clinton crashed her airplane in Iran, bumped her head, right? And that's where they told everybody she'd fallen down the stairs and broken her head. No, she was found bleeding in an airplane, okay? Bleeding in an airplane in Iran because they were going to Iran. Okay, and this was secret. I think she left from like Bahrain or someplace down there, United Arab Emirates. But she was on a transport. She was flying into Iran. This was not official business. So whatever she was doing there wasn't right. Well, she ended up crashing. Some people got killed. She was found bloody and unconscious, was taken to a local Iranian facility, and they waited for her to be airlifted out. That's why she was wearing those funny glasses, because I think it knocked the crap out of her. That happened a week after my final. I said, "Hey, you got a problem." I said, "Hey, you New World Order folks. I mean, if you don't fix this, you don't get to launch your world party here." You know, I warned them. And as soon as
we're 6-7 years later. So, have they made any strides turning this big ship around?
well, yes, April 19th was 7 years, and you tell me. All of a sudden, Donald Trump happened. I think Donald Trump was installed.
Oh, actor in chief, absolutely.
Oh yeah, but you know he's got a job to do, and I look. I mean, our society has always been in hands of reasonable people, and I think right now they've decided with some of the material that we're talking about tonight. This is new. Having people actually talk about the law and responsibility at this level. Are you kidding? It may be thousands of years in coming. Okay, you know, before that it was all divine right. You know, and we had a little time during the beginning of the Republic where primary law was, you know, plenary law was actually, you know, outed. And they spent the last, you know, last 200 years trying to get that cat back in the bag. How many of you folks know what your true founding document, power document is? Anybody know what the real power document is?
No.
You think it's the Constitution?
Declaration of Independence.
Oh yeah, that's the power document. That's the one that has all the power. That is the one that establishes the new concept of individual sovereignty. Why? Because there's no such thing as any other sovereignty. Everyone can be sovereign. Anyone can be sovereign, provided they meet certain standards. When you reconnect, then you can then you are sovereign. Pete, you want to say something?
You were talking about D.C. earlier, the District of Columbia, and I didn't notice if you had mentioned that they claim themselves to be sovereign nations or not sovereign states,
Sure.
sort of like.
Sure, they did. They created that in 1913. Okay, the actual country is called New Columbia. So that's the actual lawful country. So if you claim yourself to be a citizen of the United States, you are not a citizen of the several states here in America. You are a citizen of that little tiny country that's 10 square miles. It's also U.S. Virgin Islands, that's federal territory, Guam, Puerto Rico, and I'm not sure if the Federated States of Micronesia are federal territory or not. But that's federal territory. Everything else is the several states. The laws, all the laws that they write apply to their country, not to our country. We're in the several states. We're therefore occupied territory, and their law only applies on federal territory, meaning only in their courts and in their government buildings. But technically, it doesn't even apply there. So when you say, "Hey, I am a U.S. citizen," then you are a citizen of the United States of America, all capital letters. That's not America as the Constitution or as we think it is. So we voluntarily give away all of our constitutionally protected rights to be a citizen of that little country, and that little country is basically a democracy, city-state, and you are technically you give up all of your real rights to be that citizen, and people don't realize that. And if you want any, there's a great treatment by a man named Howard Freeman, and he talks about what happened in 1913. And it's a great audio, and it's on the SupremeLaw.org site, Howard Freeman was the one that actually found remedy and recourse to the law within the Uniform Commercial Code and beat the IRS. Of course, they've since closed that gateway. They use another. And I know what that remedy is too. But that's why the 1-207. He's the one that found 1-207, and he found it in admiralty law. Because what governs commerce is law of the sea. So that's why we have flags with gold trim on them, because it's admiralty. So he was the one that found that. And the judge in the case, after he beat them, he ruled in his favor, or the jury ruled in his favor. And the judge took him aside and he says, Mr. Freeman, you're an interesting little guy. Why don't we have a couple of beers? I'd like to talk to you. At which point he confirmed everything to Howard Freeman, that he was right, that he was indeed right with respect to his interpretation, and that's why he won the case. Well, unfortunately, people didn't like the fact that the judge had confirmed to Howard Freeman that he was right. So they threw a fit. That judge was Justice Thomas. And if you're wondering why they tried to invent some bogus, nonsense to deny him a court appointment, it had very little to do with pubic hairs on Coke cans or Pepsi cans, and everything to do with the fact that he confirmed the remedy and recourse under the Uniform Commercial Code. So they had to regroup and change it. Technically, what they apply now is competence, right? So if you're not knowledgeable of the law, if you're irresponsible, then therefore they gain power over you because of that, right? That's a harder thing to remedy. Why? Because it's not just a function of reserving rights. You have to be knowledgeable in the law, and that's what we're doing right this moment.
Is that a reason why every now and then it crops up that they release the drumbeat of DC needs to become its own state and turn it under the federal statutes instead of being its own sovereign?
It ain't going to happen, because that only comes from a true misunderstanding of what's actually in play here. And they're certainly not going to let the cat out of the bag that you're dealing with the several states being occupied by this little interloper. And that federal state, that federal city-state, Washington, D.C., is actually, it's run by foreigners, and it's always the same names. It's the Schiffs, the Bowers. But Bauer is actually what Rothschild's name is. Their name is Bauer, not Rothschild. Rothschild was the name of their counting house, right? Red Shield Counting House. They took the name of Rothschild, but they're actually Bowers. If you ever wondered why Eddie Bauer had all the money to just drive around and be, the outdoorsman, it's because he didn't have to worry about any money. And that's why his name shows up on our automobiles. But he was a Bauer. Right, so Rothschilds are their working names, but that's not really who they are. There were two families that ran the Red Shield Counting House. They were the Bowers and the Schiffs, and they still run it. So, okay, next bullet point. What laws does one need to know? Okay. Knowing the law of contract is pretty important. Basically, if you go through and you go through the cheat sheet and you understand all of the lawful principles that I say in there, then you pretty much got most of what it is that you need. Anything else you could probably get from Mark Passio and stuff. Technically, the laws come from your reconnection with the supreme authority. It becomes automatic to you. It's inherent in you. It's inside you. All you need to do is search within yourself to unlock it. Okay, and that comes from, discovering the self and what the self truly is. The self is this supreme authority, but you have to get to a point where you can actually reconnect that and be fused again. Right, or atoned. It is know thyself. Why? Because that self, that supreme authority, is within you. Right, the kingdom of God is within you. It's inside you. You know, where is God? But within his kingdom. Where's the kingdom? It's inside you. So where is God? Inside you. You know, it's not outside of you. Don't look out there. You won't find it. It's not in a book somewhere. It's in you. And that comes through a self-examination. The problem is that ego has put all kinds of crap in between you and the truth. And that crap you have to clear out. That's a process that you go through, and some people call it shadow work, but that's a process that you go through. And if you folks need help doing that, hey, look, this ain't my first rodeo. I can help you solve that, Lori. I mean, you're in that process. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. That's shadow work, right? That's working through the egoic problems, you know, the emotional baggage, getting rid of all of that garbage that's in between you and the truth. Once you clear that stuff out, then you can know the truth, and that's how that works.
Face your fears.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So as far as specific laws, contract law goes a long way. A good guide is actually going through, hey, look at the 7 deadly sins. Okay? If you go through and identify why those are a problem, then you'll understand how dangerous those engaging in those types of behaviors are and doing those types of things are. It is dangerous, and it causes problem. The 10 Commandments, okay, but you have to, the 10 Commandments are good, but you have to understand that it's technically the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is a restatement of the law, meaning that the duty is creating a victim, not creating a victim, right? So if you create a victim, then power in the universe is marshaled against you to make the victim whole. Right? But if you got 2 consenting adults that want to beat themselves with bullwhips, there's nothing wrong with that. Why? Because they both consent and no victim is created. Okay? If you ask permission and somebody says, "Oh no, it's okay. You can hit me with a bullwhip." Okay, so you hit him with a bullwhip. That other guy can't come back and say, "Hey, wait a minute. He hit me with a bullwhip." No, but I had your permission. Right? So if you ask, here's another person. If you ask permission, it's assumed you need permission, right? So that's how that works. The created is not more powerful than the creator. Okay? God creates man. Man creates constitutions. Constitutions create governments. Governments are not more powerful than man. Why? Because it's the created. Why? It's not more powerful than the Constitution. That should be the true objective of our court system, is to weigh the government's behavior against the Constitution to ensure that the government, who is subservient to the Constitution, abides the principle of the Constitution. Well, why? Why? Because its creator, man, who created the Constitution in the first place, is the ultimate authority. It's the sovereign. Where does he gain that sovereignty? That sovereignty comes from the supreme authority, the supreme creator God of nature. Okay, so the way this works is men are at the top, God is at the top, men are right below God, and then everything else is servant. That's not what is happening right now. Okay, that got turned around, and it got turned around. Why? Because we do not understand what our true power is. Why? Because we gave up our sovereignty. We gave it up. They didn't take it. We gave it up, and we gave it up because, hey, we're ignorant of the law, and we can fix that. We totally fix it. That's what we're doing right now. Okay, bullet point 8. Examples of who would be tried and why, because of the differences between lawful and legal. Well, technically, colorable money isn't an injury. Sorry. A dollar bill? Okay, this guy took dollar bills. Yeah, so? It's a fraud. It's not real. promise to pay. Okay? You can't be injured if somebody takes something that isn't of value. Now, if you're trespassing when you did it, that's a whole different story. Right? But if we're using lawful money that is of a lawful weight and measure, then yeah, you could call it theft. However, you can't steal from somebody who ignorantly gives you everything that they have. So we have a kind of a dicey deal in that, because most of what we do nowadays in the modern world is fiction, that a court of law would have trouble with some of that stuff. Except for, perhaps battery, or murder, or, violent crimes. But technically, because we've used colorable money, one could argue that nobody owns really anything, because you can't confer ownership of property using colorable money. So the question is, who would be tried? Well, you can try anybody. Most of the folks would be found now, if you used a true court of law against them now, you would find them to be incompetent and irresponsible, at which point the sentences wouldn't be prison, the sentences would be education. Okay? Now, if after that education, or if they refuse the education, that's a whole different story. That still doesn't mean you punish them, but they don't get to be part of the society because they don't know what the basic rules are. You would only be able to, at first, a lot of the people would be, brought before the court, and you say, hey, you did this, that worked fine for the old system. We have a new system now, and from this point forward, you're going to be held strictly liable for your actions. And if you violate the basic principles, and you create a victim through your actions, and you come before this court again, it's going to count. If we really don't like what you did, and it's something where you hurt somebody or killed somebody, we might put a rope around your neck and hang you from this tree here. Right? So everybody must be provided proper notice. So if we move to courts of law, proper notice we have the duty to issue proper notice. And how do you do that? Well, you can go to your county. You can notify the county commissioners. You can notify the councils, city councils. You can notify the state attorney general. And you say, from this point forward, you're going to be measured against a different standard. And you got to do that. You can't just change the rules in the beginning. And again, this is why education is more important, and we have to know that this stuff is available to us. We can't just, going through and instantiating stuff. Oh, you can definitely make an example out of somebody. You can definitely do that. But, care has to be, look, most people are out of their minds. That's the truth. All right, does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
With theft of money, you mentioned there was a little throwaway line there about trespassing. That's a different story. With theft of money, I would lump in identity theft of that with the money and identity. Where do you go from?
Oh, identity theft? Really? Is that little piece of paper in your wallet that says Pete Essif? Is that you? Because that's your identity.
Would you lump that in with theft of money as well as,
Yeah, because technically, they're not dealing with, our system doesn't deal with you as a man. It deals with a fictional corporation created under its authority. So, yeah. Identity theft. Why? Because what do you get with identity theft? Well, you get colorable money. And, as far as I'm concerned, if the police want to arrest my driver's license, they're free to do so. Is that driver's license me? No. That driver's license is a fiction. It's a straw man corporation. It's not me. But if they'd like to arrest my driver's license, they're free to do so. If they don't have a victim, if I haven't really truly hurt anybody, they don't have anything to say about that. That's the duty, right? Do unto others as you would have done unto you, and vice versa. Right? And if you're not creating victims, there are no crimes. If there are no witnesses, competent witnesses to the crime, there, you know, if I can prove that you're incompetent, then I can say you're not a credible witness. Why? Because you don't know the difference between right and wrong. How do you know what you saw was wrong? And how do I know that what you're saying is actually accurate if you aren't competent, if you're ignorant of the law? Until you can be a competent witness, you have to know the law. You can't serve on a jury, same reason. So there is a great motivation to learning learning what true responsibility is and how that actually works. Because, you know, one, true courts of law works on that. Societies work on that. I mean, right now we're really not fit to have a lawful government, because we don't have the people who would make that society up are ignorant of the law. So, all right. Last bullet point, number 9. Examples of who would be guilty, not guilty, and why. And I think I covered this. Most of the folks are criminally insane. We have been without the law for so long. We have been without justice for so long. Nobody knew the difference. And we really can't hold anybody to that standard until they have been issued proper notice. You can, so the function of a true lawful court initially is to set up the basic parameters, meaning that, hey, when we drag you before the court, okay, we see you, you're going to learn the law, you're going to comport yourself according to this standard, because if we see you again, you're going to be held strictly responsible for your actions. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. That is all of the bullet points. So now we can go to, you know, some independent questions. We have run from 7:50. It's almost 2 hours. You believe that? Did it feel like 2 hours? Hey, Yuri.
Nope.
No.
Yeah. So, all right. Any questions? Any comments? I'll come back after I terminate the video.
Judges. How can we, or who would stand as a judge under these courts?
Well, anybody who's atoned can be a judge. Okay. Now he's an independent. He's like a juror. He has to know the law. He has to know the application. But generally, you have two sides of the controversy, and he would make sure, one, a lot of the times the judges are the ones that make sure that the jury that he's got actually obeys. You know, he is a safety relief valve in case there's a juror on there that doesn't know their responsibility. And he's the one that also makes sure that the court is convened correctly, and that all the basic principles governing the application of law are actually met correctly. He is not an advocate for either side, but he makes sure that the conduct of the jury is in keeping with the law. Okay, and his job is to ensure that the jury is indeed sufficiently competent and responsible to render the render the verdict. At which point the judge doesn't make the decision, but he can say, hey, wait a minute, that's inadmissible because one, the jury sits and watches. One counsel or one party presents his case with respect to the accusation, and then those who are accused then has to present evidence to the contrary, or exculpatory evidence. Okay, so there's still rules with respect to evidence that both parties, both sides are going to try to push those rules. Both parties will. So the judge is there to make sure that the rules of evidence are actually maintained correctly, and the conduct of the jury and the court is maintained correctly, and that the defendant is being given every true opportunity to defend themselves. Not only that, it's not simply the jury. The jury can ask questions at any time, but they can only rule on what's actually presented. Let's say, for instance, if there's evidence that has, like say, what we call a right to privacy. It's really important that if evidence is gained through a unlawful search and seizure, then those things are inadmissible. Why? Because it wasn't in evidence, meaning that nobody saw it happening. And if they don't see it happening, it's as if it didn't exist. That's the whole justice is blind thing. So the judge is responsible to ensure that the conduct of the two parties is in keeping with the law, that they're not trying to use and do things that violate the defendant's rights, because one, he's presumed to be innocent, and two, he still has all of his rights. The fact that you can't just come in, the townspeople just can't come into the guy's house and raid his house and say, look, see, he's got this and this and this. You can't do that. If nobody saw him take it, and it's on his, and of course, if somebody sees him using it on his property, he says, hey, that's my stuff, then that's in evidence. But if it's, if it's out of sight and nobody knows it's there, you can't get it through an unlawful search and seizure. So, those are the types of rules, and those are the kinds of things that a judge would be mindful of. Making sure that the two parties that are arguing their case, aren't introducing stuff that doesn't belong there, that's unlawful. Or you also have Fifth Amendment rights. You can't compel people to testify against themselves. Okay, so there's basic principles in law, and nothing any more complicated than what we have in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Those are the basic principles that govern. Now, unfortunately, they've onboarded a lot of that stuff into federal statute, but it really needs, if it's something that important, it really needs to be codified under the Constitution through either an amendment or something. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, can existing judges migrate over?
Sure.
Or are they excluded because of the title of foreign nobility?
Well, they would have to give up their bar association, and they'd have to give up their title of title of foreign nobility. Yeah. However, some of those guys might be willing to do that because they've been practicing fiction for so long. I think for them to actually have a true opportunity to do something good, I think it's in their interest. I think you'd find some very competent judges out there that would be willing to actually to migrate over to a true court of law. That's real power. See, if you're power hungry, right? I mean, that's a real power. Of course, it's not the judge's power. I mean, he's an agent of it, but that kind of power sort of attracts certain people. That wouldn't necessarily disqualify them, but everybody wants to do good things. Well, I mean, most people want to do good things if they know what it is that they're doing is good. Everybody tries to be in the right. The problem is we've been confused. So, okay, go ahead. You were going to say something?
Can the Supreme Court be a lawful body without having a jury?
Yeah, because there's 12 of them.
So they're their own independent jurists as well as
Well, that's
judges.
what you call them, right?
Well,
yeah, they're jurists.
That leads me to my next question is about appointing them, and we've seen what went on with you. You mentioned Thomas earlier, but then we've got Gersick and Kavanaugh. The scrutiny that they went through, dragging their name through the mud from the insane people on the media, social media.
Well,
would anybody really want to go through that process to get to that point?
You would find a few things that actually change. That'd be fairly profound. You realize politics only deals in policy. It doesn't deal in law. It deals in public policy, not public law. All right, so when you elect a representative, what are the qualities of a representative that you're trying to find? You're trying to find the man who is not handing out goodies or not deciding legislature, but the guy who's better qualified to protect your rights and the rights of the most people. And that's a function of character. His honesty, his word, that's not based on how many goodies. Like somebody like Adam Schiff wouldn't even show up in Congress. So when a president appoints a judge, first, he's not going to appoint an activist judge because he knows that that's not the function of the judiciary in the first place. And two, the judge himself would know that that is not his function, because if he oversteps his authority, it's an abuse of office, and they hang him. Right? There's a whole lot of chips that come with this. An abuse of office. If you're found violating people's rights and not meeting, because you're servants, okay, it's a servant government. And if you have a servant that's violating people's rights, abusing his constitutional authority, like for instance Adam Schiff, when he intentionally obfuscates and let's say is fast and loose with the truth, you immediately are disqualified from office for that. Okay, because criminal activity is not a part of lawful government. And you immediately disqualify yourself from holding office. That's it. You're done. You're gone. And if you actually engage in an abuse of office to the extent that Adam Schiff does, and he knowingly did that, given full notice of the fact that he was going to be held to a lawful standard, you just put him on a rope, you decorate the trees of Washington with him, you leave his carcass up there, remind other guys that are walking into that building of who they work for and who they have a responsibility to serve. This idea, the self-serving idiots that are in Congress right now, goes away immediately. So as far as their appointment, what are they going to do? They're going to appoint people that do what? That diligently work towards the protection of yours, mine, and everybody's rights. Because if they're not doing that, then they don't belong there. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely different way of looking at stuff. I mean, we have very little experience with lawful government. We've been dealing in public policy since 1861. We don't even know what public law is. It's just not even remotely the same. It's so dramatically different. I watched this video. It was put out by the Mormons a few years ago, and it was a story about Martin Luther and how Martin Luther actually beat the church, and he used the law to beat the church, and Martin Luther was right. However, what I thought was kind of interesting was the way the King of Germany was bending over backwards to ensure the protection of the rights of all of his subjects. Right? What we see portrayed on TV is just simply tyrants. But this guy was a sovereign. He was there operating and very conscientious, whether to ensure that his subjects were not being subjected to a violation of rights. I thought that was pretty interesting. That sort of is something that you just generally don't see. What we see examples of tyranny. We don't see examples of sovereignty. You know, a sovereign cares for his subjects. He doesn't violate their rights. Why? Because he depends on them. You know, he provides them protection. They provide him with sustenance and food and the capacity to protect them. It's a two-way street. He's not just simply a parasite. That's not a sovereign. You know, and unfortunately, movies, TV, and stuff like that, that's not the truth. It's a fiction. It's all fiction. Unfortunately, a lot what we had in literature, even the stuff that was called non-fiction, was not the truth. See, they didn't call it the truth. They called it non-fiction. So, all right. Any other questions, or any observations, or any comments, or whether or not you feel like this was useful to you, or?
That was very useful.
Yeah, I would say so.
Extremely.
Okay. All right. Well, you know, I want to add value. You know, that's what I'm here for.
I think I would comment and say towards also whether Trump is turning the ship around and blah blah blah. I think that it's an exciting time. I think that I think he's going to create a situation where it's going to be very easy to change the situation, to change the real law.
Yeah, I can't.
I think he's teaching by contrast.
It's a dicey deal, right? And every one of you can look back in your past and see how complicated your evolution to this point was, right? You see how tricky that was? Can you imagine doing that on a global scale?
It's mind-blowing, really.
Well, I mean, you got a great ally. So I mean, when On decides, hey, it's going to happen, then it happens. And you know, the odd thing is I can't help but think that what happened to me in 2006 was very well observed by them, and you know, everything that was happened since that time, they've had fairly complete knowledge of. So they knew I was out there, and they certainly listened to the stuff that I do. I would hope that they understand that I'm working towards the best interests of everyone. And I mean everyone, including those guys that we think are bad guys. You know, they have, you know, they have a interest in this also. So it's not just, hey, well, you know, hey, we're going to, you know, the little people are going to rise up and overthrow the big, you know, the people that run the things. Well, they were running the things. Why? Because quite frankly, we weren't ready for self-governance. I mean, look around.
Yeah, I think that with the you look at the language that he uses, and the people that he's appointing, the judges that he's appointing, and what he does by drawing out the people in power and making them reveal themselves, he's showing us the fiction, and giving us the best chance that we've had in a long time to learn this on our own.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I think the key here, and this is something that that people don't want to, because they believe it to be weakness, and that is the use of compassion and mercy. There are people getting hurt. A lot of people are getting hurt. People that really shouldn't be getting hurt are being hurt. However, if we keep doing what it is that we're doing, it's just not going to stop. So we're going to have to come up with solutions that are different from those things that actually got us here. Well, what got us here? Well, it was hate, it was anger, it was spite, it was fear. Okay, it wasn't love, it wasn't compassion, it wasn't forgiveness. So if we don't learn how to do something different, then the same nonsense is just going to keep on happening. And I make a value judgment. I say, you know what? I know there's some real sick things going on. I don't do these things. But these people were confused and they did these things. Doesn't mean they're going to continue doing these things. If all it takes is for me to forgive them for what they did in the past so that they could move to a different paradigm in the future, for me, that's an easy choice. I'm prepared to forgive you for doing that, provided you don't let that happen again. Okay? But to just simply say, hey, well, I'm going to just punish you because that's just because you were bad and you did something that was terrible. Well, yeah, I mean, but look, we're all in the same boat. I mean, what I'm talking about here is new to them too. And it's a lot easier for us because we've been exposed to this for a while to be able to, make to see this stuff, and it makes sense to us. But they're still in a position where it doesn't make sense to them, and they're just operating in what they think is the right way. And then really all we need to do is just simply move this out of, a secret little discussion room and into our lives so that we can impact more people with a truly positive message. I mean, who would argue with an objective of restoring the protection of rights to every man, woman, and child on this planet? Well, technically, a child can't exercise rights until they're at the age of consent. But their interests have to be protected, and they are protected by other people who are responsible and have their rights protected. And really, I can't protect your rights if you don't protect my rights. That's just the way it works. So there's a mutual benefit to this. I can't protect your rights if you can't protect my rights, and vice versa. And this is something that we need to really understand. You get protection of rights by protecting other people's rights. That's how it works. So, if this helps in a small way, then so be it. I think it's a good idea. Who would be on the opposite side of that? I just, who would argue with that? I think everybody wants that.
At the very least, it's changing my life personally for the better. But I'd also be interested in what's the next step, even for a small group, that we could affect some change, or what the next step would be.
Well, the next, it's a lot simpler. I mean, people will come to you and want answers. You have to be in a position to be able to provide those answers. You don't have to know what it is. You don't have to know everything. But right. You can say, hey, sometimes it's as easy as, hey, man, there's a different way of looking at everything. Okay? There's a different way of looking at it. And it actually works cool. I mean, it works pretty good if you actually get through it. You don't have to keep beating, but people don't realize that it's there. And most people are skeptical. So, look, I mean, it's if what you hear and if what you experience is truly a benefit, then tell people, hey, I'm learning some stuff that's just blowing my mind, man. You ought to check it out. And it doesn't have to be any more than that. He says, I'll tell you what, enthusiasm is contagious, but And you look, and Lori can attest to this. When you start, when it starts happening for you, yeah, you want to tell everybody. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And Lori, bless her heart. I mean, I'm on Twitter and I'm posting stuff, and she's retweeting it, and she actually sometimes retweets it before I even get it out. But she gets it out there, and she's engaging people, and that, sometimes it's as simple as showing people something that they've never seen before. And I'll tell you what, some of the things that people don't often see is compassion and courage. They don't see that a lot. You can show them that. That's potent. Well, who is that? Is it?
You also become a magnet. Once you start learning certain things, the universe has a way of putting those things in front of you to drive those lessons home, and they put people in front of you to help you learn those lessons, and then those people it's contagious. There's a contagiousness to it that it rubs off on the people that you interact with. So the more people that you interact with, that while you're learning whatever lesson is that you may be in at the time, they actually also will end up somehow learning that particular lesson with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Because we're all doing this. We're all part of this. This is not just, I'm doing this. No, that's not. We're doing this. We're doing this. We're all part of it, and we're all serving a particular function. I mean, look at Adam Schiff, bless his heart. What is he teaching us? Well, he's teaching us all what we don't want. It's not easy. You think I don't think it's very easy to be Adam Schiff. But he's definitely showing us what we don't want. Because I don't think truly inside he wants it either. This is a mess. That's what we got. Well, hey folks, I'm gonna go and terminate. Hang on, I'm gonna terminate the sound, and then I'll be back. Maybe I'll even turn the cooler back on. That'd be good. All right. Well, hey, I'm Roage, and thank you, folks. I really appreciate you participating. I'm thinking that maybe this is something that we do weekly. Is Wednesday nights a good night? That's the question. What do you think? Since you guys are doing it. Is Wednesday night, every Wednesday, a good time to do this?
It's good
Works
for me.
Okay.
Works.
All right. Well, then let's. I'm gonna tentatively, we'll think of, and maybe we just come on and we just talk about general things too, because that's usually the best way to do it, because things will come to you and you'll want questions, you'll want answers to it, and lo and behold, and it's not just us, but downstream people will be listening to this, and you'll be asking the questions that they want asked. So this video actually went long. I mean, it's 2 hours and 15 minutes. So I'm gonna terminate it now. So I'm gonna say good night, and this will show up probably tomorrow on the video. So I guess I don't need to tell them that because they're not listening now anyway. So just one of those things. All right, hang on just a second. Good night, everybody.